Greetings and thank you for registering for this important webinar. My name is Jessica Bamford Love and I'm bringing you this webinar on behalf of the Cedar Falls Public Library, and we are so proud to present the Reverend Abraham L. Funchess Jr. as our speaker tonight. At the close of his presentation, my colleague Laura Pagel and I will read questions from the chat box, so please submit any questions and concerns there. This webinar is also being recorded so that we may reach viewers who want to do this important work, and this video will be made available online in the future. Reverend Funchess is a pastor, a social activist, an educator, and currently serves as the director of the Commission for Human Rights for the City of Waterloo. So we're going to get started by turning the spotlight over to our guest. Let's see here. And all right. And if you can unmute yourself.
Okay.
All right.
All right. So are we good to go?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I guess I just want to say to all of those out there in listening land, welcome. I'm excited to be given this opportunity to come to you with a conversation, a courageous conversation, I would say, about racial inequality. And I do have a PowerPoint presentation that I will use over the next several minutes to kind of guide the conversation. But obviously, I know that many of you are here tonight, perhaps because of all of the global activity that has been taking place as of late. And of course, the catalyst for it all seemed to have been that killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Indeed, when we had the opportunity to witness, that cop's knee on the neck of George Floyd, and actually hear almost literally the air seeping out of George Floyd's lungs, we knew that this was an inflection point in terms of the way we were going to talk about race, police brutality, and racism in this country. And while we're talking about this, I was just discussing with the others that Daniela Frazier, and I think that's her name, but she was the videographer. She has been undergoing much duress since all this has transpired, because she has been blamed for not intervening to break up what was happening with the police officer and George Floyd, who lay prostrate on the ground with his hands handcuffed behind his back. But the question becomes, what could she have done without getting shot or seriously injured in some significant way? I don't know the answer to that, but what we do know is that without that film, we wouldn't have anything to really go on to assess the severity and the casualness of what transpired on that fateful Memorial Day that killed George Floyd. And of course, since that time, we've seen perhaps one or two funerals, either in Minneapolis or in Houston. We've heard many a speech from many a brilliant political figure, spiritual leader, or everyday ordinary blues person who just began to let out some sense of rage about what had transpired and what they felt as George Floyd was calling for his mother, and then even his children. And of course, his mother had already died 2 years ahead of time. And so the fact that he was in such straits that he was calling out for his mother suggests that indeed something truly was going on in his life at that very moment. And it's something that I think resonates with every red-blooded American, every red-blooded human being across this globe. As I said, I do have a PowerPoint presentation, so I do want to go to that now. I'm gonna see if I can pull this up successfully, and I think I have. So if you can see that okay, I hope you can. Can you see that okay, Jessica? Okay, okay. All right. Well, anyway, this is entitled Racism and Racial Inequality. And I'm very thankful, obviously, to have this opportunity. So I guess I just made sure I put a slide in to say thank you to Jessica Bamford Love for reaching out to me. She's the library assistant at Cedar Falls Public Library. And of course, I'm grateful to meet Laura, who also works at the Cedar Falls Public Library. These opportunities are so rich, and I hope this is not the last one of these kinds of conversations, because you know, these times demand conversation, courageous conversation. And so maybe there'll be more opportunities for us to come together and interface like this. But as the title suggests, we want to talk about racism and racial inequality. And we'll start by talking about racial paradigming in America. This is a quote that comes from Ghost of Jim Crow by Higginbotham, but it says, from 1619, when the first blacks arrived in Jamestown, racial inequality was imposed through law and maintained by practices. You've noticed I highlighted through law and maintained by practices because we certainly want to emphasize that this is not some sense of paranoia. This is not a figment of anyone's imagination. The George Floyd killing was not fake. These things are real. And if you talk to many Black people, other people of color, or to use the designation that has come out now, BIPOC group, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. If you talk to the BIPOC group, I'm sure that many will tell you of personal experiences that they can relate to, where they've seen someone killed, or they've seen someone beaten up badly by someone in authority like the police, or maybe they've witnessed some other horrific crime that was perpetrated against them. And you knew it had something to do with institutional racism in this country that has, according to this particular piece I've just shared, from 1619, has been programmed into the very fabric of our democracy. This democracy is very, very flawed, and these racial inequalities have been imposed through law and maintained by practices. And I think that's key for us to remember, because it helps one eliminate the temptation to say that someone is being pathological. Their rage is not allowing them to think clearly. No, there were laws designed to make sure that these practices were maintained. And in a long history of racial oppression motivated by white desires for economic exploitation and justified by false perceptions of inferiority, Blacks were enslaved until 1865. And keep in mind, the Emancipation Proclamation was official in January of 1863, but it wasn't until June 19 of 1865 in Texas that Blacks actually got the message that freedom had indeed come to their home. And then, of course, people were separated and victimized by law until 1954. So there was another 100 years of segregation and Jim Crow laws. And we're still separated and victimized by practice still. And these are the kinds of things that we hope to touch on to help paint the picture that while much has changed, a lot of things remain pretty much the same. I'm not sure if I said that right, but there's an old adage: the more things change, the more things stay the same. There it is. Okay. So let's just keep moving here for a moment. So let's look at then the status of African Americans in the state of Iowa. Based on some research that I have been able to find, and of course, Many of you probably work in areas or out of personal interest have found some of the same data. We find this. Before the pandemic, the unemployment rate for Black Iowans was higher than the rest of the state. In comparison to a statewide unemployment rate of about 2%, Black Iowans experienced unemployment in excess of 9%. Now, this was before the pandemic. This must have been just before the pandemic, because obviously I've come across data that reflects much higher numbers. Black Iowans are most likely to be employed in the delivery of services such as the agriculture, processing, manufacturing, direct service in the healthcare industry. And we will look at some other data a little later in this presentation that talks about Black, Latino, and whites, and how Blacks and Latino are concentrated in the lower 2 or 3 tiers of a 5-tiered industry. But 24.2% of African Americans or Blacks are in Iowa working in this type of service occupation. So this doesn't deviate very much from the other data that you will find from different scholars across the nation who work with Pew Research, economic policy, and so forth. This data, by the way, was gathered from the Iowa Workforce Development and the Iowa State Data Center. Black Iowans are more likely to be incarcerated. And of course, I think many of us who have been in Iowa for a while have probably heard this particular stat more often than not when we talk about Black incarceration. African Americans make up about 4% of the state's total population, but we represent 25% of Iowa's prison population. While the population of Black juveniles is 6% of our state's total juvenile population, we also see that 32% of the youth with juvenile justice system contact are African American. And these sources are the Iowa Department of Corrections and the Iowa Department of Human Rights, the Justice Data Warehouse. There's a group there in the Iowa Department of Human Rights known as the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Planning Group. I had the privilege of working with them intimately when I worked on the state level in the Iowa Department of Human Rights. Black Iowans are more likely to live in poverty. That's probably not a surprise to anybody. The poverty rate in 2018 for African Americans was 30.7%, and for Iowa, it was 11.2%. The median household income for African Americans was $31,992, and the median household income for the state was $59,955. And please note that 73.6% of Blacks rent their homes. This is from the statewide data. The corresponding percentage for the rest of the state is 28.7%. This still comes from the Iowa State Data Center. That home ownership thing is critical to note. And so please keep that in mind as we look at other subsets of data, that obviously there's a vast difference in terms of who rents and who owns. Who rents and who owns. And as you've just seen, nearly 75% of Blacks are renting as opposed to owning. Black Iowans suffer high levels of chronic health conditions at a younger age, including high blood pressure, diabetes, and stroke. African Americans are more likely to die at early ages from all causes, including heart disease and cancer. 7.2% of Blacks do not have health insurance, compared with 4.7% for the state. And this comes from Centers for Disease Control and U.S. Census Bureau. Obviously, it is these preconditions that predispose Blacks to contract COVID much quicker, much easier because the immune system is already compromised to some degree. And so that's why we see so many of our brothers and sisters in some of the major metropolitan areas comprising over 50% of those who are dying as a result of COVID-19 running unchecked. And the last I heard, we have lost almost 118,000 people now, I guess, you know, to COVID-19. And I mean, this was something that burst on the scenes. It happened so quickly. And so we're talking about a silent killer who's taken out more people who died, I think, in World War I and II or something like that, in a matter of a few months. But indeed, Black people are dying at an alarming rate due to COVID-19 because of the preconditions, the heart disease, the hypertension, respiratory illnesses that compromise the immune system. That's also important because that will come up again in this conversation. The status of Blacks, Latinos, and Asians and COVID-19 in Iowa. Now, this is interesting. I hope you find it as fascinating as I did. Blacks, Latinos, and Asians make up a large share of the workforce in meatpacking plants, which was one of several reasons people of color or BIPOC, again, Blacks, indigenous folk, and other people of color, are overrepresented among Iowa's COVID-19 cases. And speaking of issues associated with race, BIPOC, you know, might be interesting just to talk about just a tad bit more. The reason why you want to flesh out people of color is because a lot of times the category people of color, which is, you know, a twist on colored people, by the way. Some people decided that it was probably important to regain ownership of the term, and so they put people in front of it, and so it's people of color. But the realization soon came that people of color don't always describe Native American invisibility, anti-Blackness. And so BIPOC was created to make sure that we were even more inclusive as we talk about different race and ethnicity here in these United States of America, and for that matter, around the world. But Black, indigenous people, and people of color, which is a little more inclusive and it captures several more people. April 25, by the way, Latinos comprise 22.3% of all the known cases of COVID here in the state of Iowa. And Latinos make up 6.2% of the state population. Blacks, on the other hand, represented 13.3% of all known cases and 4% of the population. Asians represented 7.7% of all known cases of COVID in the state of Iowa as of April 25, and they only represent 2.7% of the population. Now, this comes from the state website. This is also information gleaned from the U.S. Census Bureau estimates. And by the way, please make sure you complete your census. It makes all the difference in the world in terms of money allocation to various communities across the state. And I think 1% that's not actually accounted for amounts to about $30 million. And so we want to do the best we can to ensure that people are completing the census material. Overall, we're doing well, but there are still pockets of community that can do better. And we just want you to help us make sure that everyone is completing the census. It takes about 10 minutes of your time. And so you heard the conversation that we've had thus far about the preconditions that face the Black people and perhaps other people of color, lack of access to health care, and how these things contribute to making Black people vulnerable to the ravages of COVID-19. Well, just this past Tuesday, June 9, 2020, during a hearing on whether to declare racism a public health crisis in Ohio. And by the way, Minnesota I think Milwaukee, they have declared racism as a public health crisis. So this is not anything really new. But while they're debating this thing, a Republican state senator, his name is Steve Huffman, referred to the colored population, an antiquated term, right? And questioned whether blacks get COVID-19 more often because they do not wash their hands as much. Can you imagine? Can you imagine someone in this day and time asking such a question? It seems silly. Could it just be, he continued, that African Americans, the colored population, do not wash their hands as well as other groups, or wear a mask, or do not socially distance themselves? Could that just be maybe the explanation of why there's a higher incidence? Says State Senator Steve Huffman of Tip City, north of Dayton. Well, the fact that a well-educated legislator like Huffman, a vice chair of the health committee and a practicing medical doctor, would in a public setting nonchalantly use such antiquated terminology paired with a hurtful racist stereotype all in one breath reflects how unconscious this problem of racism is for far too many in this country. And this is a statement that was made by Representative Stephanie Howes, who is the leader of the Ohio Black Caucus there in Ohio. But when you reflect upon that statement, and this is an isolated statement that could join, quite frankly, a symphony of other such statements, that when you consider the cumulative impact of all those statements, is it really that surprising that we could have someone like a Derek Chauvin, I think that's his name, nonchalantly, very calmly lay on a black man's neck in the middle of the street while looking in the camera for 8 minutes and 46 seconds until it seemed he was sure that he accomplished what he set out to do, cut off all blood circulation by leaning on his neck, using an illegal hold or choke hold, whatever the case is, to cut off air and blood supply? I don't think so. Not for me and not for many people that look like me. Well, obviously that brings us, now to the question of what's going on in our Metroplex. We have a sense of what's going on in the nation. And of course, people everywhere, black and white, are responding to, these monstrosities in a way that has really reached a tipping point. And it wasn't just George Floyd that really created this outcry, but I think it was the cumulative impact of 3 high-profile deaths happening right back to each other almost. First, there was Ahmaud Arbery that received some attention. He seemed to be, guilty running while black in Georgia. And perhaps you've been following that story, but he was killed as it seemed he was trying to protect himself. And then somewhere around the same time frame, or a little bit later, a little bit earlier, my time sequence is off now, a young lady was killed in her home. And the irony of this, Breonna Taylor, the irony of her being killed in her home is that 8 gunshots, by the way. She was shot 8 times while she was sleeping in her bed. They heard a noise, they got up. And yeah, there's more to that story. And she was shot 8 times. The irony is that her mother was concerned about her because Breonna was an essential worker. And the mother was concerned that she's going to lose her daughter to COVID-19. Little did she ever realize that she was going to lose her daughter to a case of mistaken identity by police officers who ended up at her house when the target was 10 miles away. Go figure. And then, of course, the boyfriend who was with Breonna that night did have a gun, legally owned a gun. He fired because they thought they were being, intruded on. And of course, they took him down the court. Fortunately, he was not killed. And they were going to attach all kinds of charges against him. But guess what? He had an opportunity to go before a Black judge who understood something about how race and racism work in this country, and let him go free, because he understood what the narrative was based on what was explained. And it just goes to show that it does matter who's in what positions in this nation. It could save your life. And so racism, racial inequities, these things matter, and they have life and death consequences. Anyway, status of Blacks in the Metroplex. The Black population here in the Metroplex, and we talk about Waterloo and Cedar Falls, is about 12,000, 8% of the county. And then 10,744 are in Waterloo. So we represent about 16% of the city of Waterloo, but we're about 8% in the whole of Black Hawk County. The Black median income is about $26,000, which is about half of what white income is, which is about $55,000. And if you recall, for the state, the numbers weren't drastically different. I think Black median income for the state was about $31,000, and white income for the state was about $59,000. So in other words, the percentage is about the same. Blacks, regardless of where you go in the state of Iowa, are making about half of the median income of what white people make. Unemployment rate for Blacks in the Metroplex is about 23.9%. There have been some that have contested those numbers, and they brought it down to about 18 or 19%. That's fine, compared to 4.4% for white folks. And again, this is before the pandemic. We know that all these numbers are shot to kingdom come by now. And so the 23.9% for Blacks was right, I would argue then, and it's certainly right now, probably. But the point is that, listen, whether it be 23%, 24%, or whether it be 18, 19%, I think all of us would agree that it's still too high. Look at, we're comparing it to 4.4%. And then of course, the last number, according to the state before the pandemic, down to 2%. It suggests that those numbers are just extremely too high for Black people and perhaps other people of color. And the example I use is that, you know, if you go to Arizona and they talk about 3-digit heat out there, that's how they say it. It's 3 digits over here. Well, you know what? When it's hot, it's hot. And it really doesn't make a difference whether it is 99 degrees, whether it's 96 degrees, or whether it's 104, because, you know, at a certain point, at a certain threshold, hot just feels hot. Doesn't matter exactly what it is. And so the point is that when it's hot, it's hot. When the unemployment rate is too high, it's too high. Home ownership rate, 32.8% Black compared to 73.2% white. So there's that number that I was talking about. Home ownership and home equity has everything to do with wealth creation in these United States of America. And if you are renting more than you're owning and vice versa, it makes a difference in terms of your ability to obtain wealth. A few other pieces about the Metroplex, or perhaps about the city of Waterloo at least. Waterloo Police Department, and this was obviously before we just were able to get a new police chief by the name of Joel Fitzgerald, Dr. Joel Fitzgerald. We welcome him to the city of Waterloo, and we hope that his tenure is a good one while he's here. But the Waterloo Police Department settled several lawsuits related to situations regarding excessive uses of force. This is relevant because we're talking about George Floyd, police brutality, these kinds of things, by white officers against African Americans. And of course, it raises questions of training and these kinds of things. But, you know, as you listen to people in the streets, whether it be locally or whether it be abroad, people are really debating whether or not training is the issue. Because even with the best training, you still have officers that engage in behavior that upon review, people would say was excessive, especially when it comes to Black folk. And so is training really the issue? The Department of Justice and other outside experts recommended the department revise its use of force policy, which was done in late 2017. Waterloo has the highest percentage of Black residents than any other city in Iowa. Des Moines has the larger set of raw numbers, but as was just relayed, we have about 16% of our population in the city of Waterloo that is Black. And then, of course, Black incarceration. You knew that on the state level, about 25% of African Americans are incarcerated compared to a 3% rate in the population. But here in Black Oak County Jail, 40 to 50% of the inmates are Black. And 3 to 4% of the state population is Black. And 25% of the jail in the whole state of Iowa. So those numbers are really out of balance, out of kilter. And the source material for this has now been crystallized in a report done by the University Law Journal. But there was something that has recently come out, the Iowa Law Review, excuse me, the University of Iowa, Discrimination, Discretion, and Iowa's Packed Prisons by Derek Miller. I think he does a wonderful job of crystallizing this data in one particular area. And then, of course, there's a blueprint for smart justice, Iowa, that has been put out by the ACLU. And there's a lot of anecdotal data. And it's also important to note that the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice between 2015 and 2020 are source materials that help bear this particular report out. So there's a lot of documentation out there. And ladies and gentlemen, I think it's essential to also point out, I think it's also essential to point out that these numbers have not changed very significantly over the last 52 years. These numbers, in some ways, look worse than they did when Dr. King was killed, when he was assassinated in Memphis. So I think that's something to think about. Think about the persistent and nagging presence of racial inequality, not only in the whole of the United States, but in our Metroplex. It's just something to think about. All right, so I want to pick up my pace a little bit, not only on equal paychecks. When you look at the financial data that can be gleaned from places like the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis University, you begin to appreciate, if you don't already, that occupational segregation, benefits, and the racial wealth gap all make a difference and impacts life in a very concrete way for generations. Occupational segregation results in racialized patterns in which people are distributed unequally across jobs in the labor market. As I've already mentioned, Black and Latinos seem to be concentrated in jobs like restaurant, construction, and service-oriented jobs in healthcare. And white people, on the other hand, seem to be concentrated in finance and STEM-related type jobs, which are higher on that 5-sector tier. And there's not even equality when you're even in the same sector. and that contributes to the gaps, especially over a generation, much more over decades and centuries. Historical legacy and contemporary employment practices concentrate Black and Latino working people disproportionately in jobs and industries stripped of or lacking in benefits that connect work to wealth and better livelihoods. It's one of the policy recommendations that are coming out now from people like the Poor People's Campaign, or from what we would consider to be progressive politicians, regardless of what major party they come from, that suggests that healthcare should not be connected to work, but healthcare should be connected to your person. Healthcare should be connected to you as human being, as American citizen, not to your work, because when you lose the job, it suggests you lose healthcare. But you haven't died yet. But I promise you this, because the data bears it out, thousands of people die every year. Thousands of people die every year because they do not have health care. So we're talking about police brutality on the one hand, which obviously serves as catalyst to help create Black rage and any other kind of rage. But there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people that die every year because they're poor, because they don't have access to health care. And that is also a kind of violence that is pervasive in this country. Black and Latino workers face ongoing discrimination in hiring, higher unemployment rates, fewer sick days, and less workplace flexibility compared to white workers, which severely diminishes workplace stability and access to wealth-building benefits. These sources are the Labor Statistics, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Economic Policy Institute, Center for American Progress, National Academy of Sciences, and so on. So how did we get here? How is it that we got here in 2020? How in the world can someone kill someone in broad daylight, like what we witnessed in Minneapolis? How is it that people continue to die by the thousands, the hundreds of thousands every year? Why is it that we have not curbed poverty? I thought that was what Dr. King was working on in 1968. You mean we haven't, quite frankly, really addressed or redressed that issue yet? No, we have not. And there's a reason for it. How do we get here? Well, occupational segregation is a major reason that post-World War II prosperity created in the workplace primarily benefited whites. A little later, I think I talk about the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal, which kind of excluded African Americans, but it did benefit a lot of white folks. The rich and powerful began to hoard a far greater share of society's wealth. And of course, not only did they begin to do that a long time ago, starting for sure around the 70s, but clearly we see that happening today with the shift in tax policy that shifted much of the material gains to the top 1%, while leaving us everyday ordinary blues people at the bottom. We can understand how wealth, and gaps continue to persist and be created day in, day out in this nation. The intersection of wealth and race is a central axis of inequality in the United States. Racial wealth gap between whites and Blacks and Latinos has persisted over decades and has widened as a result of the Great Recession. Wealth gap springs from foundational sources like slavery, like Jim Crow, like inheritance, and it grows through policy choices. That's why your vote matters. Your vote matters. It's one of the most basic tools of American democracy. There are so many people that question whether or not their vote or their voice makes a difference. And the only response I can give to that is that, of course, your vote makes a difference. First of all, historically speaking, you must understand that people died so that you would have the opportunity to exercise the franchise and cast your vote. But more importantly, there are so many efforts out there to suppress the vote or take your vote away. clearly it means something. So we've got to internalize that and think about it. But it grows through policy choices, racialized institutions like the tax code, home ownership and equity, and the workplace. It may not be a mystery as to why 70% of Black people rent versus owning. And it does go back several decades, and it builds upon that. So just demystifying some of this stuff. There's a book out there called The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. And it is written by, and I hope I don't chop her name up too badly, Mercer Baradaran. But she posits that the Roosevelt's New Deal changed America's legal and political landscape in myriad ways. See, once again, we're not just talking about Black rage. And by the way, you know, it was James Baldwin, the great civil rights activist, the great writer who wrote Native Son, that said one time, to be Black in this particular country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. There's another writer by the name of Bell Hooks that says, for too long, people like to temper your rage because they see rage as pathological or something that indicates a sickness, and one must get control of rage. But why isn't anyone talking about how rage could actually be in service to an ethical aspiration for justice and freedom? Why couldn't rage be something to fuel your energy in positive directions as you continue to fight for a better way of living? But anyway, legal and political landscape, the law that helped maintain these practices. And perhaps nothing changed more radically than the nation's banking and credit markets. Unfortunately, most of the significant New Deal policies were administered in such a way as to maintain the South's racial hierarchy, which meant an almost categorical exclusion of Blacks from government subsidies. The bulk of the New Deal reforms can accurately be described as, and I quote, white affirmative action, unquote, because state resources were used to provide direct financial advantages to white Americans at the expense of other racial groups. And that's why it hurts. And it intensifies the rage when people say they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. Why can't you do the same? Well, we've got all this information out here that actually talks about racial inequality. The data sometimes stares us in the face and it makes us feel a little uncomfortable. And I think, quite frankly, that what's more dangerous than the data itself is the denial of the data. You know, it's one thing to be presented by data that's provided to you, let's say by social scientists. And it's another thing to say that none of this makes sense or none of this can be real, as we've seen, quite frankly, on the international and national level. It's dangerous, it's problematic. Obviously, you see me speaking as a proponent of using the data in such a way, as ugly as the data may be, to ensure that we implement policy boldly in order to try to eradicate the discrepancies or the inequities or the inequalities that are present, working hand in hand with BIPOC white individuals in order to make this nation better. There's always been a presence of our white brothers and sisters in any progressive movements in this nation. And so we know the possibilities are there, but every now and then, you know, there are different forces that are happening at any particular time in history that somehow deter our ability to come together. But the fierce urgency of now is upon us. And this is a useful framework for taking decisive action. It's called ARC, Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. So what are we going to do with this information that we've just heard perhaps for the first time in some cases, about racial inequality in the state of Iowa, in the Metroplex where we live. Well, I have some suggestions. For one, you can watch documentaries about racial history. There's some good stuff out there on Netflix. Oh my God, if you don't have Netflix, you've got to get Netflix. But Netflix has got some rich material out there. There's 13th, there is When They See Us, there's Selma, there's a lot of good stuff by Ava DuVernay, and so forth and so on, and a host of other stuff that I might not even be mentioning. There's some good stuff out there. But watch these documentaries about racial history. Find some new places to hang out. Maybe you're stagnant on your journey because you're hanging out in the same place all the time. I want to suggest to you that maybe it's time for you to begin to hang out in some new places and hang out with some new folk, because there are new plateaus that you must discover before your life ends. Number 3, create something. You're creative. You have genius that's untapped. Create something. Host a forum. Donate some money. You can give me some. Vote. By all means, please vote. Again, it is one of the most basic tools in American democracy. And to not exercise your right to vote is like spitting on the graves of all those who died and got beat up and harassed in order to help gain the right to vote. Read some good books. 3 books that I readily recommend is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. The subtitle is, Why is it so hard for white people to talk about racism? And she is an anti-racist educator who has been working with a lot of different people over 2 decades. She's a professor, a retired professor, I think, at a college in the Midwest somewhere. But this book has received rave reviews. There's another book, White Rage, The Unspoken Truth About Racial Divide by Kara Anderson. Gwen Culpepper brought Kara Anderson to the University of Northern Iowa. And we had an opportunity to interact with Kara Anderson, but she calls it white rage because in reality, a lot of people look at black rage and call it pathological, but it was white rage, Kara Anderson points out, that has maintained the racial inequality, that has protected the racial inequality. There's always, she maintains, in conjunction with so many other writers and activists, there's always a fascist white backlash when black people, other people of color, make any gains towards full participation in this democracy. And as sure as it is 7:51 right now, you can anticipate a backlash by virtue of the appearance that white and black people seem to be coming together. They seem to be coalescing around these gruesome deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, of George Floyd. You can bet your bottom dollar that there's going to be a backlash. So be ready. And then, of course, a 3rd book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram Kendi. He's a brilliant writer. He's written a tome, Stamped from the Beginning, but he has a big mind, and that is definitely one that some people swear by. So you got to check that out. Am I doing okay with time, Jessica? Laura?
So far, I'm not seeing questions, so we can keep going if you've got more to say.
I do have more to say.
Great.
All right. Consider reparations. Okay, this is the fierce urgency of now, and of course, you've seen people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, speaking before Congress, along with other people that you may recognize. But he's saying, consider reparations. Enslaved black people labor for centuries without pay in this nation. And the wealth gap, here's some more data that's startling. A 2011 study revealed that a typical white household has 16 times the wealth of a Black one. In 2014 report, for every $1 in a white household, a Black household has less than 7 cents. Black people comprise 13% of the nation, but they hold less than 3%. We hold less than 3% of the wealth. And this injustice, this racial imbalance, this racial inequality obligates reparation. Now, I'm not prepared to talk about how would that look today. The point is that we must do something. And we can have a lengthy conversation about what reparations looks like another time. Here's some other thoughts. Take down the Confederate monuments. I thought they lost. So why are the Confederate monuments still up in the public square? Shouldn't they be in a museum or something? They lost. Learn from the anti-racist educators that we sometimes quote, talk about. There's good information there. Wholesome Freedom Schools, Pilgrimage. Go on the Freedom Bus Tour that's sponsored by the Waterloo Commission on Human Rights. We go down to Memphis, Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma. We check out the Equal Justice Initiative. We've had an opportunity to explore firsthand some of Byron Stevenson's work. He has these wonderful calendars where every day it identifies some significant piece of civil rights, human rights history that informs our activity daily as to how we can engage in anti-racist work while we still have breath in our lungs. Make Juneteenth a national holiday. Juneteenth is coming up, and all next week, the NAACP, Latanya Graves, will be doing something, and I think I have the privilege of working with her on a virtual holiday celebration starting on Monday. Participate in a modern day civil rights activity. A lot of people, quite frankly, hit the streets over the last 2 weeks, and they made demands. And you know what was interesting, by the way, and this is just Funchess talking now, but you know, it's always interesting, it's always fascinating when someone says something like this. You know, I thought that Floyd died a gruesome death, but I just can't really condone, you know, the violence. As of all of a sudden now, their definition and understanding of violence, since it doesn't fit in with their politics of location, their privilege, all of a sudden now minimizes the value of Floyd's life because of the looting and the violence. By the way, I'm just going to say this, but a Waterloo native, Nicole Hannah-Jones, said that that's not violence. I think what she means by that is that that's Black rage expressing itself. And Bell Hooks, if she had her say, she would tell us that Black rage is meaningful when exercised in a judicious way because it can be healing. It can be cathartic. And what we want to do is somehow capture this rage, though, and make sure that it is targeted in actions that seek justice and freedom for everybody involved. And then, of course, you can publicly denounce racism. And if you don't like any of those ideas, I thought I'd add this. Once you become involved in the Poor People's Campaign, look, Dr. King, when he was killed, was working on the Poor People's Campaign. He says, we've got to build this multiracial coalition. And then he was taken out. Well, the Poor People's Campaign has been revived. And perhaps arguably the most famous face associated with the Poor People's Campaign right now is Dr. William J. Barber. He's working with Dr. Liz Theoharis, and the two of them are working together. But Barber, I believe, is the one that people tend to recognize a little more. He's a little louder, he's a little bigger, you know. And one of the things he says, they have all these principles and everything like that, but these questions that come out, perhaps you just saw by chance a two-part series that was officiated or moderated by Oprah Winfrey. But Barbara was on there. Waterloo native Nicole Hannah Jones was on there. Ibram Kendi, the writer, was on there, along with a few other people that you would probably know or recognize as well. But the Poor People's Campaign asked these questions that relate to the poor people's moral agenda. Did you know that there are fewer voting rights in 2018 than there were 50 years ago when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed? Did you know that while the US economy has grown 18-fold in the past 50 years, wealth inequality has expanded, the cost of living has increased, and social programs have been restructured and cut dramatically? Food stamps, child insurance, CHIP, SNAP, these things have been cut. These things have been cut. Have you been listening to the debates about whether or not the everyday ordinary blues person should get the $600 uninsurance payment, the unemployment insurance? There's some people that say, wait a minute. If you give all that money, and then that becomes a question, right? Because $600 over and above the $200, $300, $400 that they already get from their respective states. And when you think about that in light of all of the time that they've already lost because they were displaced from their job, is that really a lot of money? I mean, can't we just enjoy it for a little while? Besides, I think they're contemplating another stimulus package. But the point here is that you see how they quibble over $600 a week for the everyday ordinary blues person, but there was absolutely no problem to pass that tax plan that shifted all of this material wealth to the top 1% in our nation and left the balance of us everyday ordinary blues folks out here to dry. It's evil in my eyes. I think it is evil. Did you know that while the US, I think I read that one. Did you know that we imprison and detain more people, especially poor people, than any other country in the world? I think we have about 25% of the world's imprisoned population. Did you know that 13.8 million US households cannot afford water? Water, ladies and gentlemen. Did you know that currently 53 cents of every federal discretionary dollar goes to military spending and only 15 cents is spent on anti-poverty programs? What if we just shifted our priorities? This is the impulse that comes out of the Poor People's Campaign, that we have enough money to do whatever we want to do in these United States of America. That's how blessed we are. It's a problem of priorities. Money is not the issue. Did you see how quickly they came together and say, oh my goodness, COVID-19 has, destroyed so many possibilities. We need to do something. They said, okay, let's just give $6 trillion away. You can do it when you make up your mind to do it. Did you know that thousands of people die every year from anti-poor policies, while an extremist religious and Christian nationalist agenda deliberately diverts attention from the key issues and challenges facing the majority of Americans? I think that's poor. I think that's poor. Look, I just want you to be encouraged. I know that the data sometimes comes across as bleak, but you have to remember that it is the data that helps us really wrap our minds upon the social political realities of what's really going on in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and what have you. And I think it is the wise individual and group that embraces the data so that they can be more informed, so they can determine what policies need to be executed if they are to really try to change the trajectory of where we're going. If you don't like where we're going, then we have the opportunity to change it, but you want to make sure you're informed so that you can change it in a way that would be beneficial not only to you, but also to posterity, because you care about the babies. You care about the babies too. Thank you for listening. If you have questions, I'm glad to entertain them. And of course, you can always connect with me at some point at Waterloo Human Rights, 291-4441. And so now, Miss Jessica, I guess I'll be glad to entertain any questions or what have you.
We do have a few questions from our attendees. This first one, I'm not aware that there are any, but do you know of any Confederate statues existing still in our metro area?
No, I'm not aware of any here in Iowa.
Okay, I didn't.
Certainly not in our metro area, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Unless you want to consider, I'm being provocative here, unless you want to consider the Griffith that's on the police cars. Okay, Jessica, I'm ready to go.
Somebody is asking about a book that was on Facebook recently with Black businesses in the Cedar Valley.
Oh, yes. That's been compiled by a group of individuals that are assisting, I think, Will Frost, who is a part of Grow Cedar Valley. So if you want to get access to that book, you should be able to contact Will Frost at Grow Cedar Valley.
Okay. We have someone who's asking, when white people complain about looting and the violent protests, what can I, a white woman, say to these people?
Well, do you have to say anything to them? I mean, I guess, why do you need to say anything to them? Why do you have to say anything to the looters or to the people who are quote unquote destroying property? It might be better to be removed from that environment at the moment, because if that is in fact anything close to what we were kind of talking about, Black rage that's manifesting itself in what some would characterize as violence being perpetrated on buildings or on other material things, then it might be best not to say anything at that point if you don't feel as if you're making any significant headway. I mean, I'm just saying, because at the end of the day, we're concerned about life. We hate to see people die in those situations like that. You know, you've heard about a few people that pushed over, or they get hit either by the police or by others who are in the crowd, and that's tragic. I don't think anybody wants to see anybody get hurt, but people feel differently about the property itself, because the moment you try to compare property all of a sudden to people like George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, or the scores of others who lost their lives, well, you can't, that's not apples to apples. You can't say, well, yeah, I'm sorry about the fact that the police killed them like that, but why did you have to, the moment you said, but, that just detracts from the sanctity and the value of the life that was just lost. This state-sanctioned violence against Black bodies is something that serves as catalyst for Black rage. And, I don't know exactly what you could say to people who are in the process of looting. Personally, I would stay out of their way.
Okay, yeah, to clarify, I think what she means is, what does she say to other white people who are complaining about looting and rioting? What can we say to family members, for example?
Oh, yeah.
Who don't understand and are just upset about it?
Right, right, right. And because, and the reality is that I'm sure all of us know of people who say things like this, like, well, George Floyd, for instance. Yeah, I wish he wouldn't have passed that $20 counterfeit bill, though. As if all of a sudden, look, we got the killing on tape, but you concerned about a $20 counterfeit bill that George Floyd might not have even understood that he had. I've seen some other people come out, white brothers and sisters, that said, you know what, I had a $10 counterfeit bill, and when the people looked at it at the counter, they said, you know, this is a $10 counterfeit bill. I'm going to give this back to you. Do you have anything else? Because this one doesn't work. This goes on in different places and spaces. And so there is something about the Blackness. I would just encourage, other white brothers and sisters to understand, I guess where BIPOC is coming from. And that is the sanctity of life, the state sanctioned destruction of Black bodies that happens time and time and time again. It's been happening for centuries. And of course, we have the Eric Gardners, we have the Crawfords, we have the Floyds, the Breonna Taylors. We can go on and on and on about this. People have been killed by the state, and they have immunity, and it drives people mad.
In response to what you were saying about voting rights being less than what they were 50 years ago, someone's curious about what exactly are those things that are worth for voting.
Yeah. Well, all of the voter suppression laws that are coming out now, the gerrymandering that prevents people from accessing certain polls like they used to. Just in the recent years, we've seen people not being able to access the precincts that they were accustomed to going to because they were closed down. People were being redirected to go to other precincts in order to cast their vote. All of these efforts, and then just recently here in Iowa, I think they said we were at 80,000 people voting, but now it's 400-some thousand because of absentee balloting, and the response, the oppositional response to this explosion of exercising the franchise was that we're going to have to change that because too many people are participating in the franchise. Something about that should strike every red-blooded American as strange the very moment they hear that. Because isn't that what we want to see happening? People exercising their voice to let people know where they want to put their dollar. They want some political representation, so they express themselves. And now you're saying that you don't like the fact that so many people are engaged in absentee ballot. So so it's happening. It's happening. I know it might be challenging to think that in 2018 things are worse, perhaps, than things were 50 years ago when the laws were first passed to enable this kind of political participation. But indeed, there are some things out there, truly policies that are inhibiting people from voting. ID laws, the rescinding of the certain key criteria, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yeah, there are some things out
there. We did have another question from one of our attendees. How do we succeed in the wake of George Floyd's death when it seems so little has happened after other high-profile Black Lives Matter cases? So, yeah, what can we do this time to succeed?
Yeah, I just think that we need to engage in multiracial coalition building. I think we really do need to value the importance of the vote because when we express ourselves politically, particularly in a democracy like ours, it does make a difference. And we have to encourage people to believe that the vote matters. That's why people want to suppress the vote. And we have to convince people too to remember that it's not just a national election, but being involved on the local level is absolutely important. I have a feeling that I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak, in many ways, but the idea of engaging in multiracial coalition building, the idea of the work of the Poor People's Campaign, which is dear to my heart, because I'm involved with the Poor People's Campaign. So I always say I want to talk about that. That's the unfinished work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dr. King saw that it wasn't so much the civil rights, and civil rights obviously was important because there was a point in time when we didn't even have the opportunity to enjoy that. But obviously when we did gain civil rights and we were able to sit down at the lunch counter to get a hamburger, Dr. King said that, it's great to have civil rights, but if you don't have economic rights that affords you the money to buy the hamburger, what's the point of being in the store at the counter? And so that push all of a sudden to make sure that the playing field was leveled, and all of this now new analysis and study that's being compiled by people of all stripes and ethnicities as they realize that we have more than enough wealth to eliminate starvation and poverty entirely. It's just an issue of priorities. It's just an issue of priorities. The money is there, but we have got to be bold and learn how to ask for what we really need. One of the things, for instance, that I heard Dr. Barber talking about in the recent two-part series moderated by Oprah Winfrey is that we've got to be sure to ask for enough because I know after watching George Floyd, many of us are narrowly concerned about police brutality and bringing a stop to that. But the reality is that not only are people dying in general and Black people, BIPOC folk and specifically at the hands of the state when it comes to the police department, which is quite frankly just an outgrowth of the slave master and so many of these other people who were put in charge to keep people in check. That goes all the way back to early plantation life. But people are also dying because of poverty, because of lack of access to health care, because they're not being trained and getting the education necessary that would afford them to have a different kind of life if they were granted the opportunities that are readily available to full-blooded Americans, but not you. If we can just make sure that we galvanize people, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or what have you, to understand that we're all in this together, and then we work. And this is not necessarily socialism, because I can hear the opposition say, that's so democratic socialism. Perhaps democratic socialism, perhaps. But nonetheless, the idea of coming together and expressing ourselves through a very American tool of the vote is critically important. And that's how we make our world better. But no, I wouldn't get caught up in thinking that I suffer no illusions, about the world changing because of what we saw with George Floyd. Because I certainly hear the questioner on that one. Shucks, we just saw Rodney King get beat up by 30 officers. We might have come together for a little while. Even Rodney King was saying, can't we just get along? But obviously that was short-lived. People came together for a moment when we saw and heard about Trayvon Martin. Well, we came together for a little while, but that was short-lived. Hey, when we had the first Black president, everybody around the nation, crime went down in Washington, D.C. for a day or so. They said there was no crime. But we saw that that was short-lived. People started saying that we're going to live in a post-racial society because we elected the first Black president. So now we're living in a post-racial society. Well, just based on what we witnessed in the last month, we know that ain't so. You know, we've got a lot of work to do, and we can't take our foot off the pedal until our last breath has left our bodies. And so, to use the words of Dr. Barber, you know, imagine you have 48 hours left. How will you use your last breaths? We saw George Floyd dying in real time right before our very eyes. But how will we use our last breath in order to make the world a better place?
I think we have a couple more questions. Someone was just wanting to know, do you know if there are Freedom bus tours planned for the future, or where they can find more information on that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked, because the Waterloo Freedom Bus Tour is something that we do right here through the Human Rights Commission. We've been 2 times so far, and we typically go in November. But of course, COVID hit us. And so now we're just trying to navigate whether or not we even be able to do it this year. But, you know, we have some partners that are ready to help us go. And I need 20 to 25 people that will sign up. And I hope to still go in November, right after the elections. We go for a week. We go to Memphis, Birmingham, Selma, and Montgomery. And then we'll come on back after being down there for a week. But for $3.99 per person, $3.99 per person, we can have a fabulous time. And so you can always call the commission, 291-4441. If you can help me get 20 to 25 people together, which I consider to be an optimum group, we'll make that trip together and we'll have a great time.
Great. Someone else wanted to know, is there a group locally that is specifically involved in the Poor People's Campaign with you? And also a follow-up question, do you know if there's a group from Iowa going to Washington, D.C. to march on June 20th?
No, you know, because of COVID, they're no longer meeting in Washington, D.C. It's going to be a virtual gathering. And so, yes, there are people from the area that participate with me, and I've tried to enlist others that can be there when I'm not there. But there's a conference call that happens, and so there should be information that's trickling out all over the community as we get closer to this virtual gathering on June 20th. But I certainly hope that you will make time to listen to the speakers. They're very moving. You hear live stories, you hear real stories about people who are struggling in so many different ways, and why the need is so imminent for us to really begin to stop the game playing and really buckle down and figure out how can we make you know, this world a better place to live for all of us and not just a few of us.
All right, thank you. So just to follow up with one of those questions, so is there a group specifically with the Poor People's Campaign, or a group that is involved more with those ideals?
I don't think that there's a specific group in the Metroplex right now that's working on that. That can change, of course, though. And so maybe I'll talk to more of the people that I know of from the area. I think Brother Spence over at First Congregational Church is a part of this Poor People's Campaign movement. And so people can certainly connect with him. You can certainly connect with me. And as we learn of more people who are very interested in being a part of the Poor People's Campaign, we will start a group and meet you know, weekly in order to you know, get a sense as to what we can do in order to educate our community on the principles and the aims of the Poor People's Campaign.
Um, what about people wanting to maybe have a copy of your PowerPoint presentation so that they can share it with their friends or print it out? Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, we try to be selfish with our stuff sometimes because we
Yeah.
reuse it.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah. And but I mean, they can certainly give me a call and perhaps we can talk about that.
Okay. If
291.
somebody wants this information, contact Abraham directly.
Yeah, and maybe we can figure out how we're going to do it or something like that.
Well, all of the books, at least most of them I know of that were mentioned in the presentation, are owned by the library. You can find them physically or using our digital services. Some of them do have long hold lists right now, but we are trying to keep up on ordering extra copies. Some of those are on back order because a lot of people want to do the work and read the books.
Yeah.
Also for documentaries, check out Canopy. Canopy starting with a K. It's a streaming service that the Cedar Falls Public Library is currently, we have a free trial of it right now, so you can access that with your library card. I browsed it the other day and I know that they've got a lot of documentaries and things about the topics that we talked about tonight. So that's a resource to check out. I think we're only having the trial until the first week of July before we make a decision on whether we're going to continue paying for this service. So you may want to just check that out if you want to maybe watch something instead of read something.
And Jessica, I'm so appreciative for the opportunity to talk, to our citizens this way. What is the likelihood of, like, for instance, the library, helping facilitate a book read? For instance, if we wanted to read White Fragility together, for instance, those who took the time to tune in tonight, could we do it via a medium like this? Or, because I want to do the same thing, hopefully, in the Waterloo vicinity too, through the Waterloo Public Library. But I love the idea of the collaboration as we try to read White Fragility and perhaps White Rage. There's nothing that suggests that we couldn't read two books at the same time, with different facilitators, working with individuals like you.
That is an opportunity that our library would love to be a part of. It's just a matter of us partnering with a facilitator like yourself.
I would absolutely love to help facilitate such a book. This is one of the things that we wanted to do. And of course, we were thinking about trying to do it, in person. But this may be a wonderful way to reach out to a larger audience. But what we miss, of course, is the interaction, because when you have ideas, people want to respond right away, and so that might be a little challenging. But it still may be good, though. We should try it.
And on the other hand, it's easier to work into your schedule if you don't have to worry about travel time.
That's true.
A lot of our attendees want to tell you thank you. They enjoyed your presentation, and I'm seeing responses that they would definitely be interested in a book chat.
Okay.
Like you were discussing. So.
Okay. Well, then I look forward to working with you, and perhaps we can talk about this more in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Fabulous. Fabulous. Well, I do appreciate the time. It was fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much for working with us. I know our community is ready to do some good work, and so we can use all the leadership we can get there.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
And thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.